Hey everybody, how's it going? So I want to do a brief video on the competitive, contentious, and definitely complicated relationship that John Lennon and Bob Dylan had over the course of John's life. Now, the Beatles came to America in 1964. They had a huge hit with I Want to Hold Your Hand. And while they were in America, they picked up Bob Dylan's album, The Freewheeling Bob Dylan, and were blown away by it. The Beatles told in interviews that it never left their turntable. They played that album constantly. They were so impressed with his songwriting, with the topics of his song, that he wasn't singing strictly about love. And it definitely influenced the Beatles and their own songwriting. Now, the first time that Bob and the Beatles met was August 28, 1964. The Beatles had just performed a concert in New York, and they were invited back to Bob Dylan's hotel suite to party. Now, Bob Dylan had obviously heard I Want to Hold Your Hand, and so he invited the Beatles to partake in some marijuana with him. Now, the Beatles confessed rather sheepishly that they had never tried pot before. And Bob Dylan was kind of taken aback by that. He's like, what are you talking about? Of course you have. What about that line in your song, I Want to Hold Your Hand, I get high, I get high, I get high. And the Beatles kind of looked at each other and they said, what are you talking about? That's not what the line says. The line is, I can't hide, I can't hide, I can't hide. Well, anyway, Bob, undeterred, offered the Beatles some marijuana. It was the first time they had tried it, and it definitely expanded their minds. Now, this is not going to be a video about how marijuana creeped into the Beatles' songwriting, how albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver might not have been possible if not for this twist of fate, to borrow a Bob Dylan lyric. But nonetheless, the Beatles began using pot very religiously, I guess you could say. John in particular was very influenced by Bob Dylan's songwriting, and you can hear it on songs like I'm a Loser and You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. It was also very prominent on the Rubber Soul album, particularly in the song Norwegian Wood. Now, when Bob heard Norwegian Wood, and he'd heard the other Beatles songs as well, he was a little irritated because he felt the Beatles, and John Lennon in particularly, needed to stay in their lane and stop trying to copy his material. And so on Bob Dylan's next album, Blonde on Blonde, he recorded a song called Fourth Time Around, which was sort of a, okay, you guys are going to steal from me, I'm going to steal from you. And the melody is borrowed heavily from the song Norwegian Wood.
When she said don't waste your words, they're just lies, I cried she was dead.
Now, when John heard that, John got a little paranoid because he felt Dylan was making fun of him, and he felt that the song was making fun of Norwegian Wood. And in interviews, he said he got very insecure, and he thought that Bob Dylan was having a laugh at his expense. But in subsequent years, he said, I understood it was just Bob doing his thing, but at the time and the space that I was in, he took it very personally. Now, Bob Dylan, on tour to support the Blonde on Blonde album, toured England, and on the evening of May 27, 1966, he spent some time at John's home for dinner, and then afterwards they took a limo ride through Hyde Park. And Dylan at the time was filming a documentary which would subsequently be titled Eat the Document. D.A. Pennebaker was traveling around with him filming footage, and so D.A. Pennebaker caught footage of John and Bob driving through Hyde Park. They're very stoned, they're probably drunk, and they're basically babbling incoherently and trying to one-up each other. They're trying to show, oh, I'm the more clever of the two, I'm funnier than you are.
Power. A matter of time. I just can't cut. Say that again, will you, Bob? Tom? Yeah? I think I'm going to turn you into Ronald Coleman. That's better. Reginald Young. Better, much better, much better. That's all the rest of them. I have Johnny Cash in my film. You're shit, man. So weird. Hey, you gonna shit when you see you won't believe it. So weird. I like kids. John's gonna shit again.
And so it's an interesting, if you ever get a chance to watch it, it is available on YouTube, but you can kind of see them sparring back and forth, trying to be the smartest person in the limo, or at least the wittiest person in the limo. So, not a whole lot of interaction between John and Bob Dylan. After that, in 1968, John, on the White Album, in his song Your Blues, name checks one of Bob Dylan's lyrics from his song Ballad of a Thin Man, particularly the line, just like Dylan's, feel so suicidal, just like Dylan's Mr. Jones. And then 2 years later, in 1970, on his solo album Plastic Ono Band, John uses Dylan's birth name as one of the idols that he no longer believes in when he said, I don't believe in Zimmerman. Now, there's not a whole lot. I don't know if Bob and John had any social interactions or met each other through the years in 1970, but John went into a self-imposed period of inactivity, if you will, from 1976 through 1980. But John was always paying attention to what was on the charts. He was paying attention to what Paul McCartney was doing. And he was also very much interested in what Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan were recording. And in 1979, Bob Dylan came out with an album, Slow Train Running, which is sort of a religious, his Born Again album, if you will. And there's a lot of religious content on that album. And one of the songs that he recorded was Gotta Serve Somebody. Well, John Lennon heard that song and flipped out. And he's like, what is Bob singing about? He felt like Bob Dylan had gone off the edge of a cliff. And John, in his, I guess, anger and frustration, wrote a parody song called Gotta Serve Somebody. It never actually got put on an album. It was just kind of a home tape that John had recorded. But it was definitely a dig at Bob Dylan, and it was a dig at that song. Not only that, but in late 1979, early 1980, John was doing a lot of recording of home tapes at the Dakota, and he recorded a couple of I guess, definitely parodies of Bob Dylan's singing style, definitely poking fun at Bob Dylan. And it's not known whether John intended for Bob to hear any of this. I doubt that he did. There wasn't that mindset at the time that I wonder if this will be bootlegged. I wonder if anybody will ever hear this. He had a tape recorder. He was just messing around, having a laugh.
It's bad enough on the beach, but it's worse in the sea.
And this was actually released, Yoko released this on the John Lennon box set, which came out in the late 1990s. So we got to hear it. Not sure if Bob heard it or not, or what Bob thought of it, but it's definitely a dead-on impression.
The official Soviet newspaper said the temple members had protested the mindless arms race and the filthy war in Vietnam.
Now, Bob Dylan was pretty silent about John Lennon until his album Tempest, when he recorded what seems to be a tribute to John called Roll On, John. And it references several song lyrics like A Day in the Life and just sort of what John meant to the 60s and what John meant to his generation. It's a very touching, tender song. I don't know that Dylan is speaking personally about his relationship to John, but nonetheless, that is sort of the final word that we have about Bob and John's relationship. So anyway, you know, obviously Bob had he was good friends with George Harrison. He had a much better relationship with George, less competitive and more of a kind of a friendly rivalry, if you even want to call it that. But with John, it was a little bit different. So anyway, that's my take on it. Just wanted to throw that out there. We're getting near the anniversary of John Lennon's death here in a couple of days, and I just felt like doing a John Lennon video. So anyway, hope you're doing great. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Let me know what your take is, and take care.